On the 5th of September, 1638, at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris, an event occurred for which the French court had waited for more than 20 years. Queen Anne of Austria gave birth to an heir to the throne. The child arrived after a long, childless marriage, endless prayers, and pilgrimages. The boy was named Louis Dieudonné, or Louis the God-given. News of the prince's birth spread instantly across France. In Paris, bells rang, and people took to the streets with torches, staging spontaneous celebration. King Louis XIII, who for many years had doubted he would ever become a father, wept while holding his newborn son. France had gained an heir at a time when the 30 Years' War was raging, and royal power was struggling to keep the aristocracy in check. Louis's childhood was spent in a world of luxury and anxiety. His father was a sickly, withdrawn man who preferred hunting and solitude to court life. Real power lay in the hands of Cardinal Richelieu, who systematically broke the resistance of the nobility, strengthened the army, and bolstered the state apparatus. The boy lived in the Louvre and other residences, surrounded by gold, marble, and tapestries. But beneath this outward splendor lay an empty treasury, heavy taxes, and constant intrigue. Anne of Austria, a Spanish princess, loved her son dearly and tried to protect him from court conflicts. But her own position was difficult. Her relationship with her husband remained cold, and her correspondence with relatives in Madrid aroused suspicion among the French nobility. On the 14th of May, 1643, when Louis was only 4 years old, Louis XIII died of a lung disease. The child became King of France under the name Louis XIV. Naturally, he could not rule on his own. According to the will of the late king, Anne of Austria became regent, and Cardinal Giulio Mazarin, a student and continuator of Richelieu's work, assumed a key role in the government. The coronation took place on the 7th of June, 1654, at the Reims Cathedral. The 7-year-old Louis underwent the ancient ritual. A crown was placed on his head, and a scepter and orb were placed in his hands. The archbishop anointed him with sacred oil. This ceremony secured for the child not only power but also the image of an anointed of God. Mazarin became not just the first minister to the young king, but his mentor. An Italian by birth, he combined a soft manner with a harsh policy. The cardinal continued Richelieu's line, strengthening absolutism, limiting the privileges of the aristocracy, and increasing France's role in Europe. Louis spent hours with him, watching him conduct negotiations, receive ambassadors, and settle financial and military issues. Mazarin explained, "The king must know everything that happens in the state, but he is not obliged to reveal his feelings and intentions." This lesson in court and politics would become the foundation of Louis's reign, teaching him to hide his thoughts behind a flawless mask of majesty. However, the years of the regency were turbulent. The 30 Years' War continued, requiring immense resources, and taxes rose. The Paris Parliament, where representatives of the nobility and the wealthy bourgeoisie sat, spoke out more and more loudly against new tax edicts. In August 1648, the resistance reached its peak. The Parliament refused to register royal decrees, and Anne of Austria's attempt to arrest the ringleaders triggered an explosion. Barricades made of logs, barrels, and wagons appeared in Paris. Citizens took up arms and demanded the resignation of Mazarin. Thus began the Fronde, a series of civil wars that would last until 1653 and deeply impress the young king. The first serious clash with the rebellious capital was a humiliation for Louis. On the night of the 6th of January 1649, the royal family secretly left Paris for Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The departure was hasty. There was a lack of belongings and provisions. In winter, the castle was damp and cold, the heating was weak, and food was scarce. The child king slept on a hard mattress under a single blanket. This episode, the cold, the hunger, the fear, remained with him for the rest of his life. From it, he drew several conclusions. The monarch's power could prove very fragile, the capital was capable of rebellion, and the king's safety was not guaranteed even in his own kingdom. The Parliament's fronde soon grew into the fronde of the princes, as the high aristocracy joined the fray. Part of the nobility decided to use the unrest to regain the political influence they had lost under Richelieu. Prince Condé, a hero of recent battles, defected to the opposition and led the rebellion. The country split into camps. Cities and provinces chose sides. Princes and dukes changed allies based on calculation. Spain, France's traditional adversary, supported the Frondeurs, hoping to weaken royal power. Louis, still a teenager, was forced to travel with the army, seeing besieged cities, ruined villages, and starving peasants. The war was no longer something distant. It was being fought on French soil and destroying the lives of his subjects. The turning point came in 1652. The army, commanded by Marshal Turenne, one of France's best generals, defeated Prince Condé's forces near Paris. The capital was blocked, supplies were running low, and the inhabitants were tired of the chaos. In the autumn, the Parliament capitulated. Mazarin returned to power. Louis was by then about 14 years old. He entered Paris as a formal victor, but with the memory of barricades and cold nights in Saint-Germain, Prince Condé fled. Other leaders of the Fronde asked for forgiveness and received it, but trust in the nobility was lost. The Fronde became Louis's personal school of power. The experience of his childhood years showed him how dangerous a strong aristocracy was, how unreliable urban elites were, and how quickly a capital could turn into a battlefield. Later, while ruling independently, he would do everything to ensure he would never again depend on parliaments, armed princes, or the Parisian mob. From the fear of a repeat of the Fronde would grow his aversion to living in Paris, his choice of Versailles, and the particular style of absolutist rule in which the king would become the sole center of decision-making. The Fronde subsided. The country was gradually being returned to order. For young Louis, these were years when childish fears had not yet left, but a sense of strength was added to them. The teenager was not tall, but solidly built, with dark hair and an attentive gaze. He loved hunting, music, and especially dance. At court, ballets were regularly staged in which the king did not just attend but took on leading roles. In 1653, the Ballet of the Night was performed, a performance lasting many hours where young Louis appeared in the guise of Apollo, the sun god. In a costume sparkling with gold, he ended the act like a sunrise dispersing the darkness. The image proved symbolic. From then on, the sun became his personal emblem. The king saw himself as the center of the world, around which everything must revolve. Later, the nickname Sun King would stick to him in the memory of contemporaries and descendants. While Louis danced in court ballets and mastered the role of a monarch on stage, Mazarin continued to manage France. The cardinal conducted foreign policy, managed finances, and controlled the army. But unlike the early years of the regency, he now tried to involve the king in affairs more often. Louis attended council meetings, read dispatches from ambassadors, and listened to ministers' reports. Mazarin explained, step by step, the structure of European politics, the complex ties of dynasties, and the state of the treasury. Thus, the young king learned not from books, but by observing the living work of power. The main issue of those years remained the war with Spain. The conflict, which had begun under Louis XIII and Richelieu, continued after the end of the 30 Years' War. French armies achieved significant successes. The Spanish Empire had weakened. In 1659, on the Isle of Pheasants on the border river Bidassoa, peace negotiations opened. Mazarin personally directed them, striving to secure territorial gains for France and simultaneously formalize a dynastic union. On the 7th of November 1659, the Treaty of the Pyrenees was signed. Spain ceded a number of fortresses and lands to France, but the most important point was the decision regarding the marriage of Louis and the Spanish Infanta Maria Teresa, the eldest daughter of Philip IV. The treaty included conditions. Maria Teresa renounced her rights to the Spanish throne in exchange for a large dowry. The sum of 500,000 gold pieces was astronomical, and the Spanish treasury, ruined by wars, never managed to pay it. Later, this unpaid dowry would become the formal basis for French claims to the Spanish inheritance. The king himself did not dream of this marriage. His heart was occupied by Maria Mancini, Mazarin's niece. The young Italian woman was educated and lively. She spoke with Louis not only about entertainment but also about books, politics, and the future. The king seriously thought about a marriage for love. For the dynasty, this would have been a scandal. Mazarin was unyielding. The union with Spain was more important than the monarch's personal happiness. In the end, Maria Mancini had to leave the court, and Louis made the decision that the state demanded of him. On the 9th of June 1660, the wedding took place in the church of Saint-Jean-de-Luz on the Atlantic coast. Maria Theresa came to France via the Isle of Pheasants, where she met her future husband and the French court for the first time. She was modest, pious, and raised in the strict atmosphere of the Spanish court. She spoke French poorly, showed no interest in politics, and from her first days focused on religion and family. The marriage proved correct, but without passion. Maria Theresa would bear the king 6 children. Only the eldest, the Dauphin Louis, would live to adulthood. The king's private life quickly ceased to be a secret. At court, they condemned the monarch's extramarital affairs. Conversely, the influence of favorites was considered a natural part of court games. His first great love was Louise de la Vallière, a young maid of honor to the queen. Modest and sincere, she did not strive for political influence but became a genuine feeling for the king. Louise bore the king several children, 2 of whom he recognized and legitimized, granting them titles. For society, this was not a scandal, but for his lawful wife, it meant constant humiliation. Maria Theresa suffered in silence, finding solace in religion. Meanwhile, Mazarin's health was deteriorating. Years of negotiations, wars, and court intrigues were taking their toll. On the 9th of March 1661, the cardinal died. For the court, his departure was an event of great significance. Everyone expected that Louis would do as his father had done, appoint a new first minister who would take on the burden of government. Influential dignitaries were already imagining themselves in that role, but the next day, the king gathered the council and delivered a short speech. He declared that from then on, he would rule himself, without a first minister. If he needed advice, he would turn to his ministers, but the decisions would be made personally. For France, this was a surprise. Several generations had grown accustomed to the fact that beside the monarch stood a figure like Richelieu or Mazarin, who directed policy. Now, the 23-year-old king announced that he was taking full power into his own hands. Louis's decision was based not only on ambition but also on experience. He remembered that the Fronde had begun under a regency and with an all-powerful minister. The belief in the divine nature of royal power and the lessons of the childhood unrest were combined. The kingdom should no longer depend on someone else's will. From that moment began the truly personal rule of Louis XIV, which historians consider a classic example of absolutism. The king built a new work style. Every morning, he spent several hours in meetings with ministers, read reports, and signed decisions. Reports had to be concise and clear. Louis himself asked questions and demanded specific figures and reports. Ministers turned from co-rulers into executors of the royal will. Unlike many monarchs, he did not allow himself either laziness or a total retreat into entertainment. Labor became part of his image. The king demonstrated that he knew what was happening in every area. And this was not just a pose. To implement his program, Louis consciously relied not on ancient aristocratic families but on people of non-noble origin. They owed everything to the king and therefore remained loyal. The most important of them was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the former manager of Mazarin's affairs. Colbert was distinguished by his neatness, industriousness, and intolerance for the plundering of the treasury. Having received key financial posts, he began methodically restructuring the economy. Colbert started from the mercantilist idea. The strength of the state is determined by the wealth of the treasury and the development of production. To keep gold from flowing abroad, One needed to sell more than one bought, develop one's own manufactures and trade, and create a fleet in colonies. On his initiative, royal manufactures for silk, tapestries, glass, and weapons were opened in France. The mirror and tapestry productions were especially symbolic. Previously, huge mirrors and the best fabrics were brought from Venice and Flanders. Now they were made in France. The king's palaces and residences were decorated with French goods, demonstrating not only taste but also economic independence. The state actively intervened in the economy. Merchants were given privileges and subsidies. High duties were imposed on foreign goods. The export of gold was strictly limited. Trading companies were created for operations in the East and West Indies. A military and merchant fleet was built. All this was intended to strengthen the financial base of the monarchy and allow the king to conduct an active foreign policy. Thus, in the mid-1660s, a triangle formed that defined the subsequent reign of Louis XIV. On one foundation stood the personal experience of the Fronde and the conviction of the necessity of absolute power. On another, the organized court world, where the king had already become accustomed to being the center of attention. On the third, the new administrative and financial system that Colbert was building. Ahead lay Versailles, army reforms, religious decisions, and a series of wars. But their roots went back to this formative period. After asserting his personal rule, Louis concerned himself not only with finances but also with what he considered the heart of the monarchy, the court. The experience of the Fronde had shown him how dangerous, powerful, and independent aristocrats were. If allowed to live in their castles, manage their own lands, and maintain private detachments, they could at any moment turn from subjects into rebels. The king decided to deprive the nobility of its political support without taking away its outward luster. The instrument was the system of the court and etiquette. Louis turned court life into a continuous ceremony. Every day was scheduled almost to the minute. The morning rising, mass, work meetings, lunch, walks, entertainment, evening receptions. Everything flowed according to established order. The right to be present at certain moments of the day was strictly hierarchical. To be admitted to the bedroom during the king's awakening, to hand over a shirt or a shoe, was considered the highest honor and a confirmation of special favor. Aristocrats strove to be as close to the king as possible. They waited for hours in waiting rooms to receive a look, a word, or orders. Positions, pensions, and profitable marriages for their children depended on this. Removal from court meant not rest, but the beginning of a fall. Louis's famous phrase, addressed to a nobleman asking for leave, "I do not see you," sounded like a verdict. Whoever the king does not see disappears for everyone else as well. The fear of being in disgrace held the nobility at court more firmly than any chain. To remain at the top of the court hierarchy, the nobles spent huge amounts of money on outfits, carriages, festivities, and gifts. Louis consciously encouraged this race of luxury. The more an aristocrat invested in life at court, the fewer resources they had left for an independent political gain. Gradually, former feudal lords turned into courtiers, dependent on mercy and pensions. Formally, their titles and honors were preserved, but real power shifted to royal officials and intendants, people appointed and paid from the center. In parallel, Louis reorganized the army. Before him, French troops largely remained a collection of regiments commanded by owner-colonels. Discipline and supplies depended on the goodwill and fortune of a specific owner. The king and his minister of war, the Marquis de Louvois, began to see this as a threat. The army had to be a support for the throne, not a gathering of almost private detachments. Louvois conducted systematic military inspections, created warehouses for weapons and food, and organized a network of hospitals. Soldiers were assigned a uniform and equipment. Officers were approved by the king. Barracks were built. Now troops did not disperse to their homes in peacetime but were constantly under the control of the state. The increased role of training and drill made the French infantry more manageable and cohesive. By the end of Louis's reign, the size of the army reached several 100,000, making it one of the largest and most organized in Europe. Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, a genius engineer, supplemented this system with fortification. On the king's orders, he created a chain of fortresses along the borders, the so-called Iron Belt of France, star-shaped bastions, deep ditches, and a well-thought-out system of fire allowed for better defense against artillery. Simultaneously, Vauban developed a method of siege based on gradually approaching the enemy walls with the help of parallels and zigzag trenches. This made the French masters of siege warfare. The army and fortresses together turned France into a military machine capable of both defending and conducting offensive campaigns. Internal policy increasingly followed the principle: one power, one law, one faith. The religious question occupied a special place. In the country, after the Edict of Nantes of Henry IV, a significant Protestant minority, the Huguenots, remained. The edict guaranteed them freedom of worship and a number of political rights. For Louis, raised in the spirit of Catholic absolutism, the existence of two religions in one state looked like a threat to unity. He saw in the Huguenots a group capable of relying on foreign support and resisting central policy. At first, the pressure was mild: restrictions on building new temples, limitations on access to positions, and the closing of Protestant schools. Gradually, the measures became tougher. From the beginning of the 1680s, dragoons cavalry units were sent to the provinces to be quartered in the homes of Huguenots. The soldiers often behaved rudely, ruined housing, and threatened the owners. The goal was simple: to force families to voluntarily convert to Catholicism. This practice became known as the Dragonnades and became a symbol of forced conversion. Under pressure, many Protestants formally renounced their faith. Catholic preachers reported to the king about thousands of conversions. In Louis' circle, the conviction strengthened that Protestantism in France had almost ceased to exist. Bishops and the clergy pushed the monarch to the final step. In October 1685, at the Palace of Fontainebleau, Louis signed an edict that repealed the Edict of Nantes and effectively banned Protestant worship. Temples were subject to destruction or transfer to Catholics. Schools were closed, and pastors were expelled from the country. Ordinary believers were forbidden to emigrate. Formally, they were prescribed to remain and return to the true faith. In reality, tens and hundreds of thousands of people left France illegally through mountain paths, by sea, under the guise of Catholics. They headed to Holland, England, Brandenburg, Switzerland, and the colonies. Among those who fled were many artisans, traders, officers, and masters of high-end manufacturing. The economic damage was significant. Some industries lost their best specialists. Moreover, the Protestant powers of Europe saw in this policy evidence of intolerance and cruelty. France's reputation suffered, and the confessional factor strengthened anti-French alliances. Louis himself believed he was fulfilling a religious duty. He was sure that religious unity strengthened the state. The Catholic Church in France enthusiastically welcomed his move. Bishops compared the king to Constantine and Charlemagne, thanking him for cleansing the country of heresy. However, relations with Rome remained complicated. The king defended Gallican liberties, the traditional autonomy of the French Church from papal authority. He insisted that French bishops be appointed by the king, and that papal decisions not be in effect in France without the monarch's consent. In 1682, an assembly of the clergy adopted the Declaration of the Clergy of France, which limited the Pope's pretensions to interfere in secular affairs. Thus, in the religious sphere, too, Louis sought to be the supreme arbiter. In the mid-1680s, the system built by the king reached maturity. The court at Versailles and the network of ceremonies ensured control over the nobility. The army and fortresses provided support for foreign policy. Financial and administrative reforms strengthened the center. Religious policy eliminated internal confessional duality at the cost of the exodus of part of the population. Externally, this looked like the apogee of absolutism, but beneath this brilliant surface, tension was already accumulating. Constant wars, tax burdens, dissatisfaction with persecutions, and the first signs of society's fatigue from the state's continuous pressure. Even in childhood, trembling from the cold at Saint-Germain and remembering the barricades of Paris, Louis learned a simple thing. The capital is dangerous, narrow, dirty streets, crowds of townspeople, the noise of markets, all this seemed an unreliable environment for a monarch. The Louvre stood in the very heart of this restless city. The king wanted a different residence, remote yet accessible, spacious enough for the court and government institutions, one where the layout itself would emphasize his central position. The choice fell on Versailles, the former hunting lodge of Louis XIII, located about 20 kilometers southwest of Paris. The place seemed little suited for it. Swampy soil, a lack of water, forests around. But it was here that the king wanted to show the power of his will. Where previously there was a provincial residence, a palace was to arise, the likes of which Europe had never known. Immediately after the start of his personal rule in 1661, Louis commissioned the architect Louis XIV to expand the castle. It was decided not to destroy the old building but to wrap it in a new architectural shell. Around the core grew buildings forming a large cour d'honneur, the parade courtyard. In parallel, André Le Nôtre began to rebuild the surroundings into a regular park with straight alleys, geometric flower beds, and ponds. For decades, work did not stop. The scale changed, new buildings were added, and the layout became more complex. After Laval's death, the main role in construction was played by Jules Hardouin-Mansart. He developed the projects for the large side wings and the Hall of Mirrors, which was to connect the king's and queen's apartments and become the main ceremonial hall of the palace. The interior decoration was entrusted to Charles Le Brun, the king's first painter. His murals celebrated Louis's deeds, military victories, peace treaties, reform. Walls, ceilings, fireplaces, and door frames were covered with allegorical figures, coats of arms, and monograms where the sun and the king's signs were repeated again and again. The Hall of Mirrors became the culmination of this ensemble. Its length is about 73 meters. One side is completely open to the garden through 17 large windows. Opposite each window is an identical arch filled with mirror. In total, there are more than 350 mirror panels manufactured at a French factory, bypassing the former Venetian monopoly. When hundreds of candles were lit, light was reflected in endless flickers, and the figure of the king, walking through the gallery, was multiplied in the mirrors. Here, ambassadors were received, peace treaties were signed, and the most magnificent festivals were held. The space worked as a set for demonstrating the grandeur of the monarch and the state. The park around the palace was no less important. Le Nôtre planned it as a giant carpet descending from the facade into the depths of the horizon. The main axis stretched for kilometers, interrupted by pools and squares. The Apollo fountain depicted the sun god emerging from the water on a chariot, a transparent hint at the Sun King. The Latona fountain, with the transformation of peasants into frogs, recalled the story of the goddess's revenge for the insult to her children. It was easily linked to the punishment of the Fronde rebels. Sculptures, alleys, and water horizons obeyed a single idea. The entire world of nature is organized by the will of the king. The main technical problem remained water. Fountains, pools, and canals required colossal volumes. There were not enough natural sources nearby. In the 1660s, water was brought to Versailles from ponds and rivers, and aqueducts and pumping stations were built. But it was still not enough. Therefore, in the 1680s, near the Seine at Marly, a grandiose machine of Marly was built, a system of 14 giant water wheels and hundreds of pumps that lifted water to a great height and fed it to the aqueducts. Contemporaries considered this mechanism a miracle of technology. Even with it, one had to economize. Fountains were not launched all at once, but as the king approached them during his walks, the construction required immense funds. Colbert more than once expressed alarm about the expenses, but Louis treated Versailles not as a whim, but as a state project. The palace and park were to become a visible embodiment of French power and the idea of absolutism. No other European state could afford such a complex. Every facade, every alley, every ornament worked toward the same image. The king as the center around which everything is built into regular line. In 1682, Louis officially moved the court to Versailles. Ministers, nobles, servants, and guards, thousands of people moved there from Paris. The town near the palace grew quickly. In it, houses for the entourage and stables were built. Versailles became not only a residence but also an administrative center. Paris remained a major economic and cultural hub, but the political heart of the country beat in a different place. Life at court followed a strict rhythm. In the morning, the lever, the king's rising, took place. At the appointed hour, the bedroom doors opened, and the entourage entered according to rank. First, the closest relatives and highest dignitaries, then those of less noble standing. Each had their place and their role: to hand over clothing, bring water, or speak a short greeting. Mass in the palace chapel, several hours of work with documents and ministers, a public lunch, a walk or hunt, evening entertainment, plays, concerts, balls, and finally, the coucher. The ceremony of retiring to bed was organized according to the same ranking principle. The king's day became a spectacle where he was the constant center of attention. For the courtiers, this system meant constant tension. One had to not only follow fashion but also know all the subtleties of etiquette: when and how to bow, where to stand, whom to yield the way to, at what moment to present a request. A mistake could cost one's position, and absence from court cost even more. Aristocrats became increasingly dependent on royal favor, on pensions and position. Their own estates were managed through intendants and officials subordinate to the crown. They remained rich and titled, but political initiative gradually passed to the bureaucracy. Versailles was a theater where Louis played the lead role and simultaneously acted as director. The space emphasized his path from the bedroom through the mirrors and halls to the garden, where he could appear on the perspective axis like a figure on stage. Nobles, diplomats, artists, scientists, and soldiers all found themselves part of this staging. Filled with light, water, and gold, Versailles became the main symbol of his era. But the glow of luxury hid the underside: huge expenses, envy, the fear of courtiers, and the detachment of the political center from the daily life of the majority of subjects. By the time the main work was completed, Louis had achieved the main goal. He had moved the center of power to a place he himself created and controlled. He gathered the nobility around him, depriving them of their former independence. He showed Europe a model of a royal residence that other courts began to emulate. Ahead lay wars, religious decisions, and personal tragedies. But the scenery for the drama of his reign had already been permanently erected. By the mid-1660s, royal power in France seemed strong. Finances were being put in order. The court controlled the nobility. The army had become regular. The next step Louis considered was the expansion of borders. In his wife, Maria Theresa's hereditary rights, lawyers found a convenient pretext. After the death of the Spanish king Philip IV in 1665, the throne was taken by his son from his second marriage, Charles II. Maria Theresa, as the eldest daughter from the first marriage, had formally renounced the inheritance, but the Spanish had not paid the promised dowry. French lawyers cited the local law of devolution in some provinces of the Netherlands. According to it, children of the first marriage had an advantage in inheriting part of the family estate. From this, the conclusion was drawn that a number of territories of the Spanish Netherlands should pass to the Queen of France, and therefore under the rule of Louis. Spain, although weakened, refused to recognize such claims. In May 1667, the French army under the command of Marshal Turenne crossed the border and began the War of Devolution. The offensive was swift. Fortresses in the Netherlands surrendered one after another. The French occupied Lille and a number of other key points. Fighting on foreign territory, The well-supplied army demonstrated the new quality of Louis's military machine. The successes alarmed neighbors. The Dutch Republic, which until recently had been an ally of France against Spain, now saw in Louis a threat to its position. The Spanish Netherlands served as a buffer zone for it. The loss of this barrier could bring French troops right to the Dutch border. In 1668, Holland managed to create a triple alliance with England and Sweden. In response to the threat of a broad coalition, Louis chose to stop. In May 1668, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was concluded. France retained part of the occupied cities, including Lille, but refused more large-scale claims. In a military sense, the campaign showed the strength of the French army. Diplomatically, it was the first signal that Louis's attempts at territorial expansion would cause the unification of other powers. Relations with Holland quickly deteriorated. Louis believed that it was the Dutch who had spoiled his success. It was also economic rivalry that pushed him to a new war, now against a former ally. The Dutch Republic was the richest trading power in Europe. Its fleet sailed all the seas. The East India Company controlled a significant part of Asian trade. Amsterdam was one of the continent's main financial centers. For Colbert, the Dutch were direct competitors to French merchants. For Louis, they were Republicans and Protestants whose model of success contradicted the ideal of a Catholic monarchy. Before the new war, the king conducted great diplomatic preparation. In 1669, he concluded the secret Treaty of Dover with the English King Charles II. England, for French subsidies, pledged to support France against Holland. The neutrality or benevolent course of a number of German princes was secured. Spain was in decline and could not play a decisive role. In April 1672, France declared war on the Dutch Republic. The Franco-Dutch War, also known as the Dutch War, began. The French offensive was swift. The army, numbering over 100,000 men with the support of Allied contingents, invaded the Dutch provinces. Cities were captured. Many fortresses surrendered without long sieges. The presidencies and provinces were disorganized. It seemed Holland was about to collapse. But the country resorted to a decisive step. It used its main natural resource: water. On the orders of the authorities, sluices were opened. Low-lying areas were flooded, turning part of the territory into continuous shallow lagoons. This Dutch water line stopped the French troops. The heavy army simply could not move over the flooded terrain. Simultaneously, a political change occurred. William of Orange, a young and energetic leader, came to power and led the resistance. The Dutch remembered 1672 as the year of disaster, but the country held out. William managed to organize the defense, strengthen alliance ties, and turn the struggle against France into a pan-European affair. Gradually, Spain, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and a number of German principalities joined Holland. The English Parliament, dissatisfied with the pro-French policy of its king, forced Charles II to withdraw from the alliance with France. The war dragged on for years and covered several theaters: the Netherlands, the Rhineland, Spanish possessions, and Italy. The French army won major victories. Marshal Turenne maneuvered brilliantly, inflicting defeats on Allied troops. Prince Condé and Marshal Luxembourg also proved themselves to be talented commanders. Vauban directed sieges, applying his methods of gradual approach to fortresses. However, neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. In 1675, Turenne died at Sasbach, which was a sensitive loss for France. By the end of the war, all participants were exhausted. Negotiations led to a series of treaties of Nijmegen, signed in 1678, 1679. France returned the captured provinces to Holland but received Franche-Comté and a number of cities on the border of Flanders from Spain. Thus, Louis did not achieve the direct goal of crushing the Dutch Republic. However, the French border shifted eastward and southward, strengthening the country's strategic position. After Nijmegen, France found itself at the height of its power. The army was glorified, the territory expanded, and Versailles shone as the cultural capital of Europe. The French language became the language of diplomacy. French fashion and art set the tone at many courts. But the successes had a flip side. Other powers now saw in Louis not just a strong monarch, but a potential hegemon seeking to subordinate Europe to himself. This sense of threat would become the basis for subsequent coalitions, first the League of Augsburg, and then the large-scale struggle over the Spanish succession. Simultaneously, constant wars and construction cost France more and more. Despite Colbert's efforts, expenses grew faster than income. Taxes lay as a heavy burden on the peasantry and the Third Estate. Externally, the system created by Louis looked stable and brilliant. Inside, however, fatigue and tension were accumulating, which would manifest during the next, even more difficult conflicts. After the Treaty of Nijmegen, France looked like a victor. Borders were expanded, the army was glorified, and Versailles became a model for other courts. But it was precisely these successes that gave birth to fear. Neighbors increasingly saw in Louis not a guarantor of order, but a threat to the balance of power. Attempts by the king to use so-called reunions, legal commissions to annex new lands in the east to France only increased the alarm. By the end of the 1680s, a new major conflict was brewing. In 1686, the League of Augsburg was formed, an alliance of a number of German princes, the emperor, and other rulers directed against French expansion. It was not yet a full-fledged military coalition, but it showed the mood. The pretext for the war was Louis's attempt to expand influence on the Rhine. In 1688, French troops invaded the Palatinate and captured a number of cities. In response, a broader alliance formed against France, the so-called Grand Coalition or Grand Alliance. It included the Emperor, Holland, a number of German princes, and, after the Glorious Revolution in England and the overthrow of James II, the new English King William III. Thus began the 9 Years' War, also known as the War of the League of Augsburg, which lasted from 1688 to 1697. The conflict covered almost all of Western Europe. French armies fought on the Rhine, in the Netherlands, in Italy, and on the Pyrenees. At sea, the French fleet clashed with the forces of England and Holland. Previously, Louis had often fought against one or two powers. Now, a broad coalition stood against him. France won significant victories, especially on land. Marshals Luxembourg and Catinat earned the reputation of skilled commanders. But the war dragged on. The rivals could not break each other, but peace on Louis's terms was impossible. Meanwhile, the French economy experienced increasingly serious tension. 9 years of hostilities, constant drafts into the army, and tax pressure undermined the economy and caused a rise in dissatisfaction. By the end of the 1690s, it became clear to all sides. Resources were running out. In 1697, peace treaties were signed in Ryswick. France retained Alsace but returned Lorraine to its dynasty and renounced part of its acquisitions on the right bank of the Rhine. Louis made an important political concession to England. He recognized William III as the lawful king, ending official support for the exiled James II. The 9 Years' War showed the limits of French capabilities. The country retained a significant part of its influence but was exhausted. It seemed peace could bring a respite, but a new question was already looming over Europe: the Spanish succession. The Spanish king Charles II was childless and terminally ill. The vast Spanish monarchy included not only Spain itself and its colonies but also southern Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and the Spanish Netherlands. If these lands went to France or Austria entirely, the balance of power in Europe would change radically. Louis had rights to the inheritance through his wife Maria Theresa. The Austrian house had rights through other branches of the Habsburg. Attempts to preventively divide the inheritance through treaties with England and Holland ran into resistance in Madrid. In his will, Charles II, who died in 1700, transferred the entire Spanish monarchy to Louis's grandson, the Duke of Anjou. The will simultaneously contained a condition that the French and Spanish thrones should not be united in the same hand. But the choice in favor of a Bourbon was in itself worrying to other powers. Louis was faced with a choice: accept the will and risk a new war, or refuse and cede Spain to the Habsburgs. He decided to accept. At the end of 1700, the Duke of Anjou was proclaimed King of Spain under the name Philip V. According to legend, Louis presented his grandson to the courtiers with the words, "There are no more Pyrenees," a phrase that was given the symbolic meaning of the expansion of French influence. In any case, the appearance of a Bourbon on the Madrid throne caused alarm in London, The Hague, and Vienna. Additional irritation was caused by a demonstrative step by Louis. He recognized the son of the deposed James II, who lived in France, as the heir to the English crown. This was perceived as a direct challenge to William III and the English Parliament. In 1702, England, Holland, and Austria concluded treaties, creating a new grand coalition. Thus began the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714. This conflict became the most difficult of Louis's entire reign. France and Spain fought against the combined forces of England, Holland, Austria, a number of German states, and later Portugal and Savoy. The main opponents on the battlefield for the French were the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy. At first, the war unfolded relatively slowly, but in 1704 the disaster at Blenheim occurred. The Franco-Bavarian troops were routed. Bavaria was withdrawn from the war. This was a blow to the prestige of the French army, previously considered almost invincible. In subsequent years, French troops suffered further defeats at Ramillies and Oudenarde. In 1709, the Battle of Malplaquet became one of the bloodiest. The Allies formally won, but their losses were so great that they could not develop the success. Nevertheless, by this time, France was at its limit. Taxes had reached a heavy level. Military spending consumed the lion's share of the budget. An especially difficult trial was the winter of 1708-1709. Frosts destroyed crops and vineyards, and rivers froze. Famine began, from which hundreds of thousands of people died. Prices on markets rose. There was no bread in the villages, and unrest became more frequent. To support monetary circulation, silver tableware and even parts of the decor in Versailles had to be melted down. In conditions of famine and war fatigue, the situation proved hopeless. Louis tried to achieve peace. The negotiations, which began in The Hague and then in Utrecht, were accompanied by heavy demands from the Allies. At some point, France was expected to drive Philip V out of Spain itself and, in effect, act against its own grandson. The king could not go along with that. He appealed to the French with a call to resist, acknowledging the severity of the situation but refusing to accept terms he considered humiliating. This gesture, unusual for an absolutist monarch, resonated. Patriotic sentiment strengthened, and the army received reinforcements. Gradually, the situation began to change. In 1711, Emperor Joseph I died, and the claimant to the Spanish throne, Archduke Charles, became the new emperor. The prospect of the unification of Austria and Spain caused no less apprehension in London and The Hague than the possibility of the unification of France and Spain. In England, a Tory government came to power that advocated for peace. The coalition began to crack. The English and Dutch were ready for a compromise. In 1713, in Utrecht, peace treaties were signed between France, England, Holland, and a number of other powers. Philip V retained the Spanish throne but renounced his rights to the French crown. Thus, the union of two monarchies in one set of hands was prevented. Austria received most of the Spanish possessions in Italy and the Netherlands. England strengthened its position as a maritime and colonial power, receiving, in particular, Gibraltar. In 1714, the peace with Austria was finalized in Rastatt. France emerged from the war severely weakened but avoided plans for dismemberment. Victory in the dynastic sense, the preservation of a Bourbon on the Spanish throne, combined for Louis with personal and state losses. The country was ruined, the national debt grew, and French hegemony in Europe was undermined. Inside the country, a long-term economic crisis was brewing. All this fell on the shoulders of the aging king, who had to sum up his own policy. To external and internal trials were added family tragedies. In 1711, the Grand Dauphin, Louis's eldest son, died without ever ascending to the throne. The heir became his son, the Duke of Burgundy, an educated and religious man in whom many saw hope for reforms. But in 1712, a measles epidemic broke out in the royal family. First, the Duke of Burgundy's wife, Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, died, then the Duke himself, and soon after, their eldest son. The younger boy, the future Louis XV, remained alive. In a short time, the dynastic tree had been severely pruned. The old king survived almost all his direct heirs. He saw how his children and grandchildren died, how war and disease took not only ordinary subjects but also members of his own family. All this happened against the background of social fatigue, financial difficulties, and doubts about the correctness of the path taken. Formally, the system of absolutism continued to exist. Versailles was still the center of power, but by the beginning of the 17th decade of his reign, it became clear that the era he had created was entering a phase of decline. By the beginning of the 18th century, Louis was over 70. Behind him were decades of wars, construction, and court life. France remained a major power, but the former luster had faded. The treasury was burdened with debts. Villages were devastated by mobilizations and taxes. Part of the trade was intercepted by England and Holland. In Versailles itself, there were fewer festivals and more worries. The aging king spent more time in his office and chapel. After the Treaty of Utrecht, Louis received a very brief respite. The foreign war ended, but the internal consequences remained. Many provinces had not yet recovered from famine and ruin. Attempts to restore order to finances ran into resistance from privileged strata that did not want to share the tax burden. Absolutism, which gave the king formally huge powers, in practice required careful compromises with the nobility and financial elites. Working with ministers, Louis saw how difficult it was becoming to carry out decisions without having fresh resources to back them up. The heaviest blow for him were the family losses. The already mentioned deaths of the Grand Dauphin, the Duke of Burgundy, his wife, and their eldest son left Louis with only one direct heir, a small great-grandson. Around the prematurely orphaned boy, the future Louis XV, a circle of people formed on whom the future dynasty depended. Among them, the Duke of Orléans, the closest adult prince of the blood, and the boy's governess, the Duchess de Ventadour, who protected the child from the interference of court parties, stood out. The king's private life by this time was calm and withdrawn. Madame de Maintenon, with whom he was in a secret marriage, remained his closest confidant. She paid attention to charitable and educational projects, such as the school in Saint-Cyr for girls from impoverished noble families. Louis, exhausted by intrigues and worldly vanity, found solace and religious support in her company. The magnificent festivities and ballets for which Versailles was famous gradually gave way to a stricter and almost monastic atmosphere at court. In the spring of 1715, the king's health deteriorated sharply. In August, he felt severe pain in his leg. Doctors first decided that it was gout, a disease to which he was prone. But soon it became clear that it was gangrene. The leg turned black, the pain intensified, and medicines hardly helped. Doctors were powerless. Gradually, the news spread. The life of the Sun King was coming to an end. Realizing the approach of death, Louis occupied himself with what he considered his final duty. He signed a series of orders regarding the regency and guardianship of his great-grandson. By his will, part of the powers were to be transferred to his legally born, but later legitimized sons, the Dukes of Maine and Toulouse, in order to limit the influence of the Orléans house. This decision would yet cause political struggle after his departure. The most touching episode of his final days is associated with his farewell to his great-grandson. On August 26, the 5-year-old boy was brought to the dying king's bedside. Louis spoke for a long time and to the point, reminding him of his duty to God, the necessity to seek counsel, and not to succumb to flatterer. He admitted his mistakes, saying that he had loved war and construction too much, that this had burdened the people, and asked his great-grandson to ease the subjects' taxes and keep the peace for as long as possible, calling war the ruin of peoples. For a monarch who had spent the better part of his life in campaigns and camps, such words sounded like a late admission of the cost of glory. On the 1st of September 1715, a few days before his 77th birthday, Louis XIV died at Versailles, having spent 72 years on the throne. This was one of the longest reigns in European history. The palace, which was accustomed to living to the rhythm of his day, was suddenly filled with whispers and waiting. The king's body was taken to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the resting place of French monarchs. The funeral procession proceeded in conditions of relative restraint. The country was exhausted and could not, and did not want to, stage excessive displays of grief. According to the will, real power under the child king was to belong to the created council, where Louis's legitimized sons were to play a significant role. But the Duke of Orleans, as the closest prince of the blood, was not going to reconcile himself to such a construction. Already on September 12, the Parliament of Paris annulled those parts of the will that limited the regent's rights. Orleans received full regency. Simultaneously, the right to protest against royal edicts was returned to the Parliament, a privilege that, under Louis, they had tried to limit. Thus, in the very first days after the king's death, the revision of the absolutist structure he had built began. The regency of Philippe of Orléans became a time of experiments and upheavals. On one hand, there were attempts to soften the rigidity of the former regime, involve the nobility in government, and reform finances. On the other, the financial adventures of John Law, with the creation of paper money and joint stock companies, ended in collapse and undermined trust in the government. Already in these years, the same problems that had intensified under Louis manifested: debt, an uneven tax burden, and resistance to reforms from privileged estates. The assessment of Louis XIV's legacy proved contradictory for contemporaries and remained so for historians. On one hand, he created a strong, centralized apparatus of power relying on bureaucracy and a regular army. He expanded the territory of France, achieved the recognition of French influence, and turned the country into the cultural center of Europe. Under him, the classic French style in architecture, literature, painting, and music was formed. Versailles, the tragedies of Racine, the comedies of Molière, and the music of Lully became symbols of 17th-century French culture. On the other hand, the cost proved high. Constant wars ruined the country, intensified tax pressure and famine, and undermined the long-term development of the economy. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes and the exodus of the Huguenots weakened crafts and trade and complicated relations with Protestant power. The centralization of power and the privileges of the nobility conserved social contradictions with which subsequent generations of monarchs could no longer cope. Many researchers see in Louis's reign one of the causes of the depth of the crisis that eventually led to the revolution. Louis's absolutism was rarely absolute in the literal sense. He had to take into account the interests of the aristocracy, financiers, the church, and regional elites, and seek compromises and balance. However, the symbolic image of the Sun King, around whom everything revolves, proved so powerful that it overshadowed these nuances. For friends and enemies alike, he embodied the idea of a monarch who had concentrated the maximum amount of power in his hand. In the end, Louis XIV left his heir a country that was simultaneously strong and wounded. It had a powerful army, a developed administrative apparatus, and a rich culture, but also huge debts, an uneven distribution of taxes, the society's fatigue from wars, and the heavy mark of religious intolerance. His reign became the height of French absolutism, and the beginning of the path to its crisis. The image of the Sun King departing from life with the admission of his love for war as a mistake underscores the main paradox of his destiny. A man who built his glory on victories and conquests ended by asking his heir to become a peaceful prince and to ease the lot of the people. This admission does not undo the consequences of his decisions, but it shows that even a monarch accustomed to seeing the world as a theater of his own will, in the end, sees the shadow that his son cast upon the country.